Hey everybody, I want to take a moment to make a quick video about the joints of the body. Specifically, I want to talk about the three classifications: synarthrotic, amphiarthrotic, and diarthrotic. And then I want to talk specifically about diarthrotic joints, the ones that are freely movable. So synarthrotic joints are joints that are usually connected by some type of dense fibers, and they don't really move. So an example of a synarthrotic would be like between my frontal bone and my left parietal bone. You'll see that there's a joint here, and that really doesn't move. That would be a synarthrotic joint. Then you've got what we refer to as amphiarthrotic, and that's a slightly movable joint. That would be like what we would see here between these two cervical vertebrae. There's a intervertebral disc that's located here in between these two cervical vertebrae, and so there's not a lot of movement. There is some type of flexion and extension that can happen in between these two bones, but it's not a freely movable joint like a diarthrotic joint. And a diarthrotic joint is going to be something that's freely movable. That's going to have a synovial joint that's going to be made up of muscle and ligaments and tendons and bursae and synovial fluid and all kinds of other stuff, kind of like the joint that would happen here in between this humerus and this scapula, basically where I would have the head of this humerus articulate with the glenoid cavity of this scapula. And for the sake of this model, there's a bunch of metal connecting this bone together, but if you look very closely, you can see how the rounded surface of the head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula, and it makes a freely movable joint that has a very wide range of motion here. So that would be diarthrotic. Now, when we start talking about diarthrotic joints just in general, then we start talking about freely movable joints based on the shape of the joint surface. So for example, you can see here where the head of this humerus is round, and the glenoid cavity there is an indented yet smooth out area. That's a special shape. It's a special shape of the joint surface. The shape of the joint surface is going to determine what type of movements it can actually do, as well as the name. So, for example, you have what's known as a plane joint. And let's see, let me find an example of a plane joint. If you look here, these are the metacarpals. Like down here are the carpals, that's in your wrist. And then here are the metacarpals, which are in the palm of your hand. Well, the metacarpals have plane joints. That's where this metacarpal articulates with this phalange. In other words, where the palm of your hand connects to your finger. That joint would be a plane joint. You can see how it's shaped. It's got a little bit of rounding there, and then the rest of it is smooth and almost flat. So that would be a plane joint. A hinge joint, however, would be like your elbow. Now, here's something that textbooks love to do. They love to name the fact that your elbow is a hinge joint. But you want to always remember that there are 3 bones involved in your elbow, not 2. So you have a radius bone, which is the one here with the round head, radius, round head, and then ulna, which has a U-shaped portion to it, and that U-shaped portion articulates with the trochlea on the humerus. So the trochlear notch of the ulna articulates with the trochlea of the humerus, and it allows it to make this hinge joint like the hinge of a door. Another example is a pivot joint, which I have to show you one of these up close on another video. This is when you get to the atlas and axis. So here we have the atlas and there we have the axis. And if I could take this apart, disarticulate these two bones, you would see where the axis actually has a piece that sticks straight up and the atlas slides on top of the axis, and it allows the head to rotate like this. And that's why we call it a pivot joint, because it pivots, pivoting, allowing you to make a rotating motion. Lastly, we have the ball and socket joint, which I've already talked a lot about. That ball and socket joint is taking place between the humerus and the scapula, specifically the head of the humerus with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. That makes a ball and socket. Basically, you have a ball and then you have some type of socket that is attaching to. Another example of a ball and socket joint is, of course, the head of the femur articulating with the acetabulum of the coxal bone or your hip bone. So when they say the leg bone's connected to the hip bone, that's what they're referring to. They're talking about that ball and the socket. That's there. Now, sometimes you also define joints based on the movements that they create. For example, you have the carpal bones here. Your carpal bones actually glide across one another, which is why the joints in between your carpal bones are referred to as gliding joints, because they literally glide across one another. They should have called them, in my opinion, sliding joints, because they're sliding across one another. But hey, they wanted to call them gliding. If you ever saw how your carpal bones move against one another, they literally just, it's like having a handful of dice and just rolling the dice around in your hand. That's how the carpal bones slide around or glide around one another to make motions. Sometimes you have what's called an angular movement, right? An angular movement would be like your elbow. When you bend your elbow like this is flexion. When you bend your elbow like this, you're extending it. And the way to remember is, if you remember, and you don't hate me for this, but in math, when you have the x-axis here is straight, right? So this is an angle in between these two lines. And this angle would be 180 degrees straight. Well, every time that 180 degrees becomes less and less and less, all the way to 90 degrees, see that would be 90-degree angle. Then the lesser it gets, the more flexion that's taking place. But the greater the angle, the more extension that takes place. So at 90 degrees and falling, that's flexion. At 110 degrees and rising, that's extension. And then lastly, we talked about rotation, which an example of rotation is here, where we have right and left rotation, right? Because your head is on the axis of your body. So you have right rotation, left rotation, but also you can have rotation of your forearm. And you have rotation of your forearm due to the fact that your radius articulates with your humerus. So the head of your radius articulates with the capitulum or the capitulum of the humerus, and it allows your forearm to do this. And if you look up here at the elbow, you can see where it's literally rotating. The head of the radius is literally rotating on the capitulum or capitulum of the humerus. So your humerus stays still, but your forearm rotates. So when your thumb goes towards your body, that makes it medial rotation. When your thumb goes away from your body, that becomes lateral rotation. You ever play a game called 7-Up when you were a kid? You had to have your thumb up like this. then it would go down like that or go up like this. That being able to do that with your forearm is the same as this. You're just rotating your elbow, which makes a very unique movement. That would be medial rotation. This would be lateral rotation. And that's all we're going to talk about for now. Wanted to keep it short and sweet to talk about some key items concerning classes of the shape of joint surfaces and the movements of these joints. So if you like this, make sure you like this video, subscribe if you haven't, feel free to share this with your friends. We'll see you next time.